Members of the University, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. As Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, it gives me very great pleasure to warmly welcome you all to the University tonight at the outset of our second Festival of Ideas. And may I begin in our customary way with an acknowledgement of the Wurundjeri people, the traditional owners of the land on which this festival will take place. May I also ask you, as the lecture is being recorded live, to ask you to turn off your mobile phones and pages, please. In the words of our Vice-Chancellor, Glyn Davis, the festival is the university's gift to the people of Melbourne. For the next 5 days, you will hear leading scientists and social scientists, lawyers and historians, writers and performers, artists and art historians discussing and debating the theme of the pursuit of identity, landscape, history and genetics. Tracking the nature of identity is not the province of any one discipline or branch of knowledge. We know more about the human body today than ever before, thanks to the genetic revolution of the last 50 years and more. That same revolution has given us the power to alter nature as never before, raising big and serious questions. Those questions will be addressed in our festival. Unlike the first emperor of China, we know that history did not begin with us. Our past shapes our present and may determine our future. What we were and what we have become is one of the key elements in the study of identity. In Australia, the pursuit of identity, fashioned in the distinctive role for ourselves in the world, asking what it means to think, create, and imagine in this country, has been a wellspring of creativity and originality. As Australians, we often feel that the distinctive qualities of the landscape, be it bush, the outback, or the coastal plain, has shaped our identity, both in times past and in the present. Our artists from the beginning have given voice to the land, made us see it, and given it value and meaning. So if we are going to answer questions about identity properly, we are going to need the help of scientists and social scientists, historians and lawyers, artists and writers, and that is exactly what the Festival Ideas brings together over the next 5 days. We need other voices, fresh viewpoints besides our own to define the issues and set our concerns in a wider context. It is the pride of the university that the festival has attracted so many eminent speakers from overseas and interstate to speak alongside our own distinguished faculty, and we are honoured by their presence and truly grateful to them. Tonight we are delighted to welcome Dr. Matt Ridley to the campus to launch the festival with the first keynote lecture on genes, technology, and the evolution of culture. Dr. Ridley is a scientist and preeminent writer on science. He was science correspondent and American editor of The Economist and co-founder of the Centre of Life in Newcastle-on-Tyne. He has published numerous books, most recently The Rational Optimist, and he is that rare author whose books are read equally avidly by scientists and non-scientists alike. Tonight, he proposes to put the cultural horse before the genetic cart and promises to give us an upside-down view of human uniqueness. Are you challenged? It is with great pleasure that I invite Matt Ridley to the podium to launch the 2011 Festival of Ideas.
Chancellor, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It's a tremendous honour to be here and to be opening this extraordinary festival, which I think has done so much for the mixing of ideas, which is kind of the theme of my talk. And it's true that I've written a lot about genes, and genes are going to play a part in the story of this festival. But in some ways, I'm not going to be very kind to genes tonight, because I'm going to argue that the more we know about them, the less powerful, the less frightening, and the less controlling they seem. I'll explain what I mean in a minute. But the question I particularly want to address, and this goes to this issue of identity, the identity of human beings, all human beings, is that there's a paradox at the heart of human evolution. Because the explosive success of the human species in its numbers, ecological impact, technology, and everything else was sudden and recent. By recent, I mean the last 100,000 years. Yet all the things that we credit, or if you like, blame this success upon, happened gradually, a long time ago. Consciousness, language, tool use, big brains, they were all in place hundreds of thousands of years ago, and yet nothing happened. We remained just another ape. Something was still missing. And we've been assuming that that something would show up in the genome or in the brain. That there would be a biological cause, a trigger somewhere that would enable us to understand what it was that suddenly made us explode into global domination. Something that gave us the ability to plan or to think ahead or something like that. And I think that's wrong. I think we've been looking in the wrong place. I think it was a simple cultural innovation, a new habit, if you like, that caused that change. And that any genetic mutations we find that relate to human capacities of that sort will turn out to be a consequence, not a cause, of cultural evolution. But to start and illustrate what I mean, I want to go back to, I gave a talk in Melbourne about 4 years ago, and I think I ended it with this point, that if the machine will respond, there we go, that genes are at the mercy of experience. And what I mean by that is that far from controlling everything that happens, genes are often being controlled by what we do in our lives. And here's an example. If you have a stressful experience, such as the machine not responding, if you have a stressful experience, then you are more likely to get ill. You are slightly more likely to catch a cold or influenza or something like that. Now, why is that? Well, it turns out that what happens is that your nervous system responds to the stress, experiences the stress, and tells your endocrine system to release hormones like cortisol. And one of the things cortisol does is it suppresses the immune system. And how does it do it? Well, it actually goes around binding to other things and switching off genes. So it actually alters the expression of your genome. And in fact, this is happening in real time. Even now, at this very second, listening to me, you're laying down new memories, I hope. And you're doing so by switching 17 genes on and off inside your brain. Well, what I mean by that, therefore, is that instead of genes causing behavior all the time, quite often we need to think in terms of behavior causing changes in the expression of genes. And I want to take that idea and replay it on a much longer evolutionary timescale over thousands of years. Because, as I've said, people, when they try and explain the human revolution, the takeoff of human beings after 100,000 years ago or so, they tend to talk in terms of genetic mutations. They talk about something having happened. Here's Colin Blakemore, a distinguished neuroscientist, talking about a dramatic spontaneous mutation in the brain. Richard Klein, a distinguished anthropologist, talking about a genetic mutation of some kind. And Bruce Larner, distinguished geneticist, talking about DNA changes that can trigger cognitive cultural evolutionary events. In other words, they're talking about biology triggering a change in culture. And I think we need to think that it's possible that culture triggers changes in biology a lot of the time. Well, let me give you an example of this. This is my genome, as you can tell. And here on chromosome 2, I have a gene, and so do you all. It's the lactase gene. And those of you who are of European descent will find that that gene is active in you as adults, most probably. If you are of Asian descent, it is probably no longer active in you as adults. Why? Well, this is the gene that enables you to digest lactose, a sugar found only in milk. And thanks to the work of Sarah Tishkoff, we know now why and how this gene is switched on or off. The problem is that in most mammals, you don't need this gene to be active after weaning, because you're never going to encounter milk as a food source in adult life. Or as a famous biologist, Arnold Schwarzenegger, once said, milk is for babies. When you grow up, you have to drink beer. And yet, in Europeans, we drink milk as adults, and we can digest it as adults, because the lactase gene is switched on throughout our lives. And the same is true of many African people. They also have the lactase gene switched on throughout their lives, which enables them to digest lactose. You can get other things out of milk, there's protein and so on, but the lactose would give you indigestion if you did not have the lactase gene switched on. So isn't it lucky that in the parts of the world that invented dairying, this gene happened to be switched on? Of course it's not like that. Here, by the way, is the gene. It's on chromosome 2. And just upstream of it, LCT is the name of the gene, and just upstream of it is another gene called MCM6, and buried inside MCM6 are some sequences which control the expression of lactase. And there are 4 different mutations in human beings, 3 of them in Africans, 1 of them in Europeans, which enable this gene to remain switched on in adults. And you can date them through Sarah Tishkoff's work. It's possible to date the European one to 9,000 years ago and the Kenyan one to 5,000 years ago. And again, wonderfully, that turns out to be just about the time we domesticated cattle. But of course it's obvious, isn't it, that it wasn't, that people woke up one day and said, oh good, I can now digest lactose, so I'll go and domesticate cattle. It was the other way around. It was the culture that led the biology there. We invented a culture, and we invented a cultural tradition of dairying. We drank milk. We got a bit of indigestion. It wasn't great because, you couldn't digest the lactose, so you had a lot of stomach cramps, but it was worth it because there was protein and stuff in the milk too. But those who didn't get stomach cramps by chance because they had this random mutation, they thrived, they were more healthy, they got more marriage offers, they had more babies, etc., and so the genes spread. That's one example. A slightly trickier and more interesting example now, because I'm trying to lead you to some really important examples that are right at the heart of the identity of human beings. This chap, Charles Darwin, he got most things right. He got one thing badly wrong. He didn't understand inheritance, and he particularly didn't understand the idea that inheritance comes in little lumps that don't get divided or tainted or dissolved when they're inside you. And I get almost cross with him about this because the idea was actually, the answer was staring him in the face. And I mean that quite literally. He had blue eyes, and he had brown-eyed people in his family. So he must have, at some point, you thought should have crossed his mind. Hang on, blue eyes can go through a brown-eyed person and come out in a blue-eyed child without being tainted by the blue-eyedness. So there must be some particulate inheritance. In other words, Mendelism. And it was the one thing missing from his theory. But actually, that's a digression. His blue eyes. What caused his blue eyes? What caused anyone's blue eyes? Again, we now know genetically the answer, thanks to the gene, by the way, is on chromosome 15. It's called the OCA2 gene. This is the one that's most commonly associated with eye color in most people. And thanks to the work of the splendidly named and blue-eyed Hans Eiberg in Denmark, we now know exactly what's going on. Again, it turns out, here's the sequence, there's the OCA2 gene. Again, it turns out that the action is in a different gene upstream of the OCA2 gene, that the gene itself is irrelevant, but it contains a control region for the OCA2 gene. And right at the 26,039,213th position on the chromosome in most blue-eyed people of European descent, the A has been changed to a G, which means, incidentally, that a brown-eyed person is more similar with respect to this particular little bit of the genetic sequence to a chimpanzee, a rhesus monkey, a horse, a cow, a cat, a dog, a rat, or a mouse than he is to a blue-eyed person. Now, why? Why did that mutation happen, and why did it spread in Northern Europe? Darwin would have said that it was sexual selection, that is to say, reproduction of the sexiest rather than survival of the fittest. In other words, like a peacock's tail, it somehow helps an animal reproduce, even though it doesn't help it survive. This was his big idea for explaining racial differences and ethnic differences in human beings. And he was right about peacocks. If you look at the data, it is clear that you get more copulations if you have a brighter tail in peacocks. So perhaps it's true of human beings too, that if you have blue eyes, you get more mating opportunities. Here's the data. In fact, I think Darwin was wrong about this. I don't think it has anything to do with sexual selection. I think there's a much more obvious answer that we now know. This is a map of roughly where blue eyes occur in Europe. It's not a map I would trust because it's based on some rather dodgy and probably Nazi pre-war German data, but nonetheless, I think we can roughly all assume that blue eyes are pretty common around the Baltic Sea. What was going on around the Baltic Sea 6,000 years ago, which is the date that Hans Eyberg has put on this mutation? And the answer is agriculture had just arrived. Now, what's special about this? Well, if you go from a diet of fish and berries and things like that to a diet of bread, then you are suddenly eating a diet that's very much lower in vitamin D. And you're living in a climate that's got very little ultraviolet light, particularly in winter. And so you're going to suffer from vitamin D deficiency diseases much more than anywhere else on the planet, because this is the most northerly place that you can grow grain to this day. As this expert has put it, only one spot on the globe enables economically competitive grain production above the 55th parallel. So what's going on, I think, is that there is tremendous selective pressure on the genome of Baltic farmers 6,000 years ago to be paler so that they can make vitamin D, because if you've got paler skin, you can use sunlight more efficiently to make vitamin D if you're not getting it from your diet. People start farming cereals near the Baltic. They get all sorts of vitamin D deficiency diseases like rickets. Paler skinned people in the tribe are healthier than darker skinned people because they're getting more sunlight through their skin, so they live longer, they get more marriage offers, which selects for any low melanin genotype, such as having low levels of tyrosine in the cells. Tyrosine is transported by a P protein, which is made by a gene called OCA2, one of whose control switches is in HERC2, which is less sensitive when it's got a G instead of an A at that particular thing, a side effect of which is blue eyes. Once again, starting with a cultural event, the invention of farming, we've concluded with a genetic change. So if it's happening for little things like eye color and the ability to digest lactose, could it be happening for much bigger things? Well, this is a much more ambitious case, which I'm going to try and make the argument to you, involving a gene that's much more famous called FOXP2, which is the gene associated with language, sometimes called the language gene. Discovered and investigated by Simon Fisher and his colleagues in Oxford University. And what they found originally was that there was a family living in London, a very large family, in which half of the people had serious speech defects and also trouble with language. Not only could they have difficulty articulating, they had difficulty learning linguistic rules. And those half who had this defect also had a particular mutation in this particular gene on chromosome 7. And when they looked at this gene elsewhere in the population, they found two other mutations, both of which also had the effect of knocking out people's ability to learn language and ability to articulate speech. So it began to look like this gene was terribly important in the development of language in human beings. But of course, as we all know, we're basically mice at the genetic level, and so all other creatures. So the first thing to do is to put this mutation into a mouse and see if it affects its vocalization, and it does, rather remarkably. If you put this KE family mutation, you make the same genetic change in a mouse as in this family, then you get different vocalizations in the mouse. So this is looking even more interesting. And if you do what Constance Scharf in Berlin has done brilliantly, you inject a virus into the particular part of the brain of an Australian bird called the zebrafinch to knock out this gene, to disable this gene in that particular part of the brain, then you prevent young zebrafinches learning the correct song from their parents, which is an extraordinary experiment. So clearly this gene has something to do with language and with the ability to learn language and articulate vocalization. And moreover, our version of this gene is rather special. It has 2 different amino acids right in the middle compared with others. And if you look at the family tree of the gene, you find that although there's been quite a lot of silent mutations that don't change the protein in most mammals, there have been 2 sense-changing mutations in the human lineage. It looks like that this gene has been under very strong selection pressure in human beings over time compared with other mammals. And so the suggestion is that maybe this is something very fundamental to the human ability to speak language and therefore to everything else that happened in human beings. And the first study of this concluded that this had all happened really quite recently, about 200,000 years ago, these 2 mutations. And so it might be that this was the trigger for, as it were, the human revolution. But then such a neat story began to unravel because Svante Pääbo and his colleagues began to sequence the Neanderthal genome from a bone that had intact DNA in it in a cave in Croatia. And to everyone's surprise, it turns out, you can't really read this, but I promise you it says it, that the Neanderthal gene, FOXP2 gene, is identical to ours. And this implies that the common ancestor with human beings and Neanderthals, which lived 400,000 years ago, already had these 2 mutations in it. So we've pushed back the origin of this linguistic ability, if you like, or this linguistic mutation, much too far in history to be an explanation of what triggered human takeoff. And moreover, we've we're still talking, everybody is still talking about FOXP2 as something that did help set off the ability to use language in humans and Neanderthals and others. But I think they're talking about it the wrong way around, because by analogy with milk drinking and blue eyes, I think it might have been the other way around. I think what happened was that we began to use vocalization a lot to communicate, and this would have put selective pressure on us for the spread of any genes that came up that made us even better at vocalization and at learning rules of syntax and grammar and so on. So it was because we were culturally deciding to speak that we got these mutations into our genome. This is not, by the way, Lamarckism. The mutations are still random. It's still a Darwinian process. But the culture can set up the selection pressure that produces the spread of a random mutation. In other words, I'm trying to put, as the Chancellor said, the cultural horse before the genetic. Well, I'm now confused about which I'm doing, but anyway, you get the point. So what did trigger this human explosion of the last 100,000 or so years? Well, on my desk at home sit 2 objects. This is one of them. It's an Australian hand axe from roughly 500,000 years ago, of the kind made by Homo erectus. And next to it sits an object of exactly the same size and shape, which I use rather more often. And the similarity in their size and shape is truly extraordinary. This isn't a fake photograph. I just noticed it one day, and I was rather struck by it. But of course, it's not that interesting. All it tells you is that they're both designed for the human hand. It's the differences that are really quite intriguing. And one of the differences is that the object on the left it could be almost any date. Homo erectus made teardrop-shaped Australian hand axes of great beauty from about 1.5 million to about 500,000 years ago. For 1 million years, 30,000 generations, they went on making these tools. There was no innovation. There was technology without innovation. Their skeletons changed faster than their tools in those days. Whereas, of course, the object on the right is obsolete after 5 years. And that's what we've got, this process of continuous change and innovation. And that's what I think it is that we have to try and understand. And these are some of the things that we've thrown at the problem over the years, that we had big brains, or culture, or language, or forward planning, or symbolism, or art, or standing upright, or religion, or imitation, or deception, or strong reciprocity, throwing weapons, fire and cooking, tool making, grandparental care, the incest taboo, cognitive fluidity, and a few sort of hyper-neurological things that might be special about human beings. These are all special about human beings. And they all distinguish us as a species from other species. And yet they all come at the wrong time. These all date from long before. Homo erectus had nearly all of these. We can't tell whether he had strong reciprocity or religion, but it's impossible to find any of these that coincide in the archaeological record with the right time. And I suspect, again, we're looking at it the wrong way around. Because here's a graph of human cognitive capacity over the last 3.5 million years. Each dot is a fossil whose cranial capacity can be measured, and we're starting to get a pretty clear picture of what is actually a pretty gradual process. And by 500,000 years ago, the brain size is roughly the same size as ours is today. And the Neanderthals, which are the vertical crosses, they had brain sizes pretty well bang on the same size as us, slightly bigger in most cases. So by 500,000 years ago, we've got big enough brains, and we've been standing on 2 legs for 4.5 million years, and we've had tools for 2.5 million years, and we've had fire for, well, we don't know how long, at least 500,000 years, possibly 1.5 million years. It's uncertain yet. And as I said, as I argued, we've had language for something like 400,000 years, if these language mutations are to be trusted. So what's going on? What happened right at the end of this process? Well, I'm going to make the argument that the key ingredient was the invention of exchange, and I'll explain what I mean by that in due course. But first I want to persuade you that culture evolves in a Darwinian way. And what I mean by that is that it has all the ingredients of a Darwinian process. It shows descent with modification, so here's a cultural family tree from a stone axe to a Neolithic stone axe to a copper axe to a bronze axe to an iron axe. You can see family trees all around you in technology, in ideas, etc., etc. It shows succession and extinction. Culture does, just like you get in ecology. And it shows variation of a fairly random kind. There's a huge amount of trial and error in technology and in ideas and in culture and so on. Look at the tailplanes on these early airplanes. People are trying it. And Tim Harford has just written a book called Adapt, which is about the role of trial and error being far more important than we realize in all the successful ideas that we come up with in politics and culture and other things. And Darwinian selection will work if there's even an element of randomness. I mean, you can still have deliberate changes, but if there's an element of trial and error, then you will get a Darwinian process. It shows replication. We copy our ideas and our technologies. And it shows competition, of course, and extinction as a result. But there's one ingredient that I think that we often forget, and that is absolutely crucial to a Darwinian process. And it's the ingredient of recombination. This is essentially sex. The point about sex is that it enables you to combine and recombine genes, to try different combinations of genes till you come up with one that's good. And you get those combinations not by mutating the genes, but by bringing them in from other individuals who might have a good idea in their genome. And basically, evolution doesn't work without sex. Until a few years ago, there were some troubling exceptions to this rule, and this was one of them. It's a creature called the Deloid rotifer, and it lives basically in puddles on streets, and it's very small, and it hasn't had sex for 80 million years. But then, a couple of years ago, we discovered that actually it's an exception which proves the rule, because instead of having sex, it tries to recombine genes. It does recombine genes by taking them out of its food. It does what's called horizontal gene transfer, which is essentially using genes from other species and other individuals, but not bothering to have sex with the individual to get the gene, just get it out of your food, which is a rather clever trick that's even better than sex for this process. So back to my computer mouse and hand axe. One of the key differences, it suddenly struck me, between them is that the hand axe is made from one substance and embodies really one idea. The computer mouse is made of lots of different substances, plastic and silicon and metal and so on, and it embodies lots of different ideas that occur to different people at different places. And they came together. And when you think about our technologies, or indeed our rules and habits in society, they always consist of combinations of ideas that occur to different people in different times and different places. It's cumulative in that sense. There's something cumulative about our culture. And evolution, what's key about sex is that it makes evolution cumulative, and I'll show you what I mean. In an asexual population like the rotifers, you can get two different mutations, a red one and a green one, and they end up in competition with each other because they're in different lineages, and in this case the green one's better, and so the red one goes extinct. But in a sexual population, at some point an individual inherits both the red mutation and the green mutation, and you get individuals which are yellow, as it were. And so that means that in a sexual population, you're drawing upon the genetic inventiveness of the whole species. You're not just relying on your mother's 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 mother for good genetic ideas. You can get them from wherever they come from in the species. And I think exchange gave us that capacity in cultural evolution and made cultural evolution cumulative for the first time. Because culture can be asexual, if you like. There is such a thing as asexual culture. Lots of other animals have it. Chimpanzees teach each other how to crack nuts with rocks. Killer whales teach their young how to grab seals off beaches. These are cultural traditions passed down that are quite different in different groups, etc. But what they never have is cumulative culture, where you continue to accrete new cultural ideas into the species. And that's because they don't have cultural sex. In other words, they don't have exchange of ideas. It's exchange, literally exchanging one thing for another. And by this, because so many of our technologies embody ideas, therefore exchanging one idea for another, that I think is absolutely crucial to the story of the human explosion. And as Adam Smith famously said, no man ever saw a dog make fair and deliberate exchange of a bone with another dog. This seems to be something unique to us. We're obsessed with swapping things with each other, and no other creature does it. So even our all our technologies consist of ideas that have come together and merged and mated and married. So this is my favorite example. It's a pill camera, takes a picture of your insides on the way through. It came about after a conversation between a gastroenterologist and a guided missile designer. Now, you may have just heard me say that no other animal does this, and I should just qualify that. There are a few examples of sort of exchange of sex for food in certain insects and things like that could qualify, but they're always within mated pairs or families or something like that. Exchange with strangers is unusual, and I'm not talking about reciprocity. That is to say, you scratch my back, I scratch yours, exchanging a different favor, the same favor at a different time. I'm talking about exchanging different things at the same time, and I think there is a crucial distinction there. Well, why does it matter? Why is the exchange of different things at the same time a good idea? How does it help? Well, I think the answer lies in the law of comparative advantage, the only proposition, it has been said, which is in the whole of the social sciences, which is both true and surprising. And it was coined by a chap called David Ricardo in 1817, a stockbroker. And he was trying to explain why free trade between Portugal and England was a good idea for Portugal, even though England was better at making everything than Portugal. Those were the days. But I'm retelling it here in Stone Age terms to try and make my point. You've got two guys sitting around a fire called Adam and Oz. and they both need a spear and an axe. Adam takes 4 hours to make a spear and 3 hours to make an axe. Oz takes 1 hour to make a spear and 2 hours to make an axe. So Oz is better at both spears and axes than Adam, although he's a little better at spears, whereas Adam's a little better at axes. Oz doesn't need Adam. He should just make his spear and his axe and go out hunting, leaving Adam twiddling his thumbs until it's too dark and too late to go out hunting. Well, no, because if Oz were to make 2 spears and Adam were to make 2 axes and they traded, then they would each have saved an hour of work. Because Oz has only worked for 2 hours and Adam has only worked for 6 instead of 7. And of course the point is this is only true because Oz is better at making spears, whereas Adam's better at making axes. But if they're starting to do this, then that's going to become even more true. The more they specialize, the more value there is in the exchange. And the more they exchange, the more the value there is in specialization. This is a fast breeder reactor. The more you do this, the more value you're going to get out of it. And that really is the process that has given us an exponential growth in human living standards. Because when you think about it, if you had to supply your own light, for example, to read a book by, it would take you rather a long time. As it is, how long do you have to work? About half a second, if you're on the average US wage, to read a book, preferably mine, for an hour by the light of an 18-watt compact fluorescent bulb. Back in 1950, you had to work for 8 seconds on the average wage to earn that much light. Which is, by the way, that's the kind of definition of economic growth, 7.5 seconds that you have got to fulfill a different need that your grandparents didn't have, or to leave the lights on if you're like my children. And back in 1880, it would have taken you 15 minutes to earn that much light. And in 1800, the average person on the average wage in America would have had to work for 6 hours to buy a tallow candle that could give that much light for that long. So that's how getting more efficient through specialization and exchange improves our living standards. And that's why the graph of world GDP, if you throw it back to 1 million years BC, which admittedly I don't think any economist really dares do, but I've done it anyway, or rather Angus Maddison has done it anyway, shows an exponential shape. And look, by the way, where it's heading, just in parenthesis, we're heading towards 100,000 to 200,000 of today's dollars per capita globally of GDP by the end of this century, if this graph goes on accelerating. That's 3 to 6 times as much earning capacity as the average American has today, and that's worldwide. So it's an incredible gig if we can keep it going. Back to the mouse and the hand axe. What's the other thing that's different about them is that the Homo erectus, made the hand axe for himself, whereas the mouse was made for me by other people. They were working for me. They got together one day, lots and lots of them, and said, let's make Matt Ridley a new computer mouse. And there were lots of them. There were hundreds of thousands, maybe even 1 million of them, because you've got to include the guy who was growing coffee in Brazil that was going to be drunk by the man on the oil rig, whose oil was going to be used to make the plastic, which was going to be used on the assembly line, etc., etc., etc. They were all working on this project, and they were all working for me, although they didn't actually know it. And having people working for you is the definition of being rich, really. Having a higher living standard. It's a fair bet that Louis XIV did not make this fancy outfit for himself. Louis XIV had 498 people to prepare his dinner every night. But you know what? You and this bunch of tourists going around the Versailles Palace, you all have 498 people to prepare your dinners tonight. They're working in cafes and bistros and restaurants and shops all over town, but they're ready at an hour's notice to produce a meal that's far more likely to have interesting ingredients in it than Louis XIV had, and far less likely to have salmonella in it. So we each have the living standard of a king compared with 400 years ago. But not because we're employing specific servants, but because people are working for each other. Everybody is working for everybody else. That Adam and Oz thing is gradually generalizing. Now, other animals do work for each other too. You get a division of labor, particularly in social insects, where the workers work for the queen and the queen works for the workers and so on. But there's a big difference, which is that this only happens within the family. An ant colony is just a big family where everybody's descended from the queen. It doesn't happen between strangers because ants also have a division of labour that we don't have, which is a reproductive division of labour. They delegate reproduction. That's the one thing we don't like to delegate. It's the one thing we rather like to do for ourselves. Even in England, or even in Australia, I should say, you don't expect the Queen to do your reproducing for you. Farming, when you think about it, is the same thing between species. It's species working for each other. Here's a shepherd. Who's working for who? The sheep are working for the man's working for the dog's working for the sheep, etc. They're all working for each other. They're all supplying their own specialist skill in exchange for what the other can give to them. So how did we get started on this habit of working for each other? I've no idea, and I can't begin to produce any evidence for this, but it seems to me that it's likely that the oldest, deepest rooted thing where we work for each other is the sexual division of labour. It's a general rule in anthropology that every hunter-gatherer tribe shows a sexual division of labour. That is to say, a difference in foraging behaviour between males and females. And the classic one is the hunter versus the gatherer, as exemplified by this Hadza tribe in Tanzania, that the men go out hunting and the women dig for roots. And it's actually a brilliant system, because effectively it means that the woman knows that if she wants protein, she doesn't have to learn how to hunt and go out on an exhausting and dangerous hunt. She just has to dig up some extra roots, which she can trade for the meat. And the man knows that if he wants access to a regular supply of carbohydrate, he doesn't have to learn how to look for roots and dig them up. He just has to make sure he kills a big enough warthog so he can exchange some meat for roots when he's ready. So economically, it's a very sensible invention. And we used to think that it was probably a very ancient human feature that went right back to the invention of central place foraging by Homo habilis before Homo erectus. And a lot of people still think that. But two archaeologists in Arizona have recently argued that it may actually be very recent. And by that I mean the last couple of 100,000 years. Because it looks like Neanderthals didn't do this. As they point out, there is no evidence for gathering in Neanderthal society. There's lots of evidence for hunting, but it's not clear what the women were doing. So they say they were probably hunting with the men. They were hugely cooperative species. They needed, when they're hunting big game, which they specialized in doing, you need every hand to the pump, and most Neanderthal women were quite strong and were far stronger than most of us men today. So it looks like Neanderthals may not have had a sexual division of labour, and they may not have got into the habit of working for each other by doing different things, by specialising, therefore. But that wasn't what, sexual division of labour in itself doesn't lead to this fast breeder I was talking about. We've got to get exchange going between strangers to understand that. And this is where I'm most excited, because I think the evidence is pointing to a very key moment in history, which is around 120,000 years ago. Obsidian hand axes and jasper tools in Ethiopia are starting to move long distances for the first time around then. And so are these beads found in Algeria, which are sometimes 100 miles from the sea. And whenever artifacts start moving long distances, it means trade. We know that because you can look at relatively recent hunter-gatherer societies, such as the Aborigines here in Australia, and the hand axes that they made at a place called Mount Isa, which I think, is it in Northern Territories or is it in Queensland? Anyway, a tribe called the Kalkadoon quarried these hand axes and traded them with their neighbours for things like stingray barbs. And as a result, you can find Mount Isa stone axes over a large section of Australia. These are moving by trade, not by migration. So the point is that the movement of artifacts over long distances tells you that trade has started. And this is 10 times as old as agriculture. Trade has been going on long before the invention of farming. Neanderthals didn't do this again. Brilliant people, the Neanderthals. I'm not dissing them. They had huge brains, and they were probably much better at surviving in Ice Age Europe than we could be. But they did not ever use materials from a long distance away. They always used local sources of materials, so they don't ever seem to have had trade between groups. And that may have been one of the reasons why they were unable to compete with modern humans when they came into Europe. The effect of this habit of trade is effectively to collectivize our intelligence, to give us a sort of cloud, arguably. This is fishing tackle from the Pacific before Western contact. And what's remarkable about it is that if you look at the sophistication of fishing tackle on different Pacific islands, you find that you can predict the sophistication not from anything else, but from the contact between islands, the amount of trade going on between islands. In other words, it's the size of the number of brains you can draw on through trade that determines how sophisticated your technology gets. And you can even tell what happens when you isolate people and you cut them off from this. And the classic example is Tasmania, which became an island 10,000 years ago, and which after that time saw none of the progress in technology that happened on mainland Australia, and indeed some regress during that time. Bone tools, for example, were largely given up after about 3,000 years ago. What's going on here is that Tasmania is cut off from the continent-sized Australian collective brain, where the exchange and specialization is bringing new ideas all throughout the continent. Tierra del Fuego is a nice test case for this, a very similar island to Tasmania, just as remote, and yet you see none of this cultural regress in Tierra del Fuego. Why not? Because the Magellan Strait is much narrower than the Tasman Strait, and there's trading contact throughout that 10,000 years across the Magellan Strait. So go back once more to this and ask not just who made the computer mouse, but who knew how to make a computer mouse? And the answer is nobody. There is nobody on this planet who knows how to make a computer mouse. I mean that quite literally. The man who runs the computer mouse company doesn't know how to make a computer mouse, he just knows how to run a company. The person working on the assembly line doesn't know because she doesn't know how to drill an oil well. And the person, you get the point, that the knowledge doesn't exist inside a human brain, however big that brain is. Because, the man who designed it, who came up with the blueprint, he didn't have to think about, where he was going to mine the copper, etc. So the knowledge is dispersed throughout society. It's in the cloud already. We invented a cloud when we started exchanging, an iCloud, if you like. There it is. There's the internet, but it's a brain. It is a brain. We are the nodes in its network. That was the trick we stumbled on 100,000 years ago. And what the consequence of it was, it may have left genetic imprints in us, but they were consequences, not causes of what we did. As we went from the individual intelligence that enabled us to make objects like this to the collective intelligence embodied in objects like this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. Matt has now kindly agreed to answer any questions that you may have. So who would like to be first? Over here.
Thank you, Matt, for a wonderful talk. Really, really exciting. You mentioned that intelligence is kind of distributed, it's sitting in a cloud. And I'm wondering whether you might consider that intelligence is actually distributed through the objects themselves, the materials.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We kind of diss technology. We kind of think, oh, that's boring. That's something engineers do. We do ideas. But technology embodies ideas, and it captures ideas, and it brings ideas together in a way. And it represents... Of course, it enables ideas to endure, ideas that occurred to people who are dead. Technology helps you do that. So I do find I get more and more interested in technology as an expression of our knowledge as I go on. I can't see where the microphone is, but oh, there it is.
I apologise in advance. I'm a fan of science fiction, and I read lots of stories about colonising other planets, etc., etc. What's the smallest sustainable community that could maintain a 21st century lifestyle, say on Earth, or if we dream of colonising future planets, do we actually have to move a couple of million people? How sustainable are we as a community?
I think that's a really good question, and one that only just occurred to me, a little bit. Some Russian actually wrote a paper recently saying something about, are we going to need trade between galaxies if we colonize space, as it were? Or getting the same point. And these Pacific islands, how do you link them up if they're space colonies? And I find it hard to sustain the technological sophistication of the modern species. I think it's possible we need 6.9 billion people. In other words, there is no smaller unit than we've got. We're not efficiently using all 6.9 billion. There are still plenty of people cut off in North Korea or wherever from joining in the conversation, as it were. And an awful lot of people are still living lives of quasi-self-sufficiency and are not able to join in this, and we call that subsistence or peasant or whatever, but we're not getting the most out of our 6.9 billion yet. But I do think that, and I'm not saying that you add another billion, you get it could be that we've got plenty of people on this planet to go far more sophisticated. We don't need 15 billion you don't need to get bigger and bigger and bigger. There must be a diminishing returns effect here. So perhaps it's wrong to say you need all 6.9 billion of us to sustain our current technology. But certainly it's going to be a problem if you put 5 people in a spaceship and send them to Mars, and expect them to embody. I mean, if the 300 of us in this room were plonked on an island, and day one we sit around and the Chancellor becomes the chairman of the group, and she says, right, does anyone here know how to go fishing or something? So I'll put up my hand, I know how to go fishing. And somebody else, does anyone here know how to stitch up wounds or something? We'd quite quickly, there'd be all sorts of skills we wouldn't have, even in this room, even this incredible room. I'm not So it's a really good question, and I'm not sure what the answer is.
Thank you very much. As the number of people increases, the standard deviation in general increases. So in the world, the number of people are increasing, so the standard deviation of intelligence is increasing as well. Isn't it one of the contributors to this rapid growth you're talking about?
Standard deviation of what?
Standard deviation of intelligence.
Of intelligence, okay. Well, yeah, but but as we improve nutrition, we enable people to fulfill their potential more. And one of the baffling trends in the world is called the Flynn effect, which is that IQ is going up at 3 points per decade in almost every country you look at. What's that all about? Well, one possibility is that the people who got left behind before in intelligence terms because they had a bad nutritional or disease experience as a child and weren't able to fulfill their intellectual potential, they're getting fewer because we're getting better food and better medicine to more people. So that implies that there's a shrinking of the standard deviation of intelligence going on as well. Sure, the more people you have, well, I don't think the standard deviation increases, but the number of people in the tails increases, but then so does the number of people at the peak. I'm not very good at maths. Does anyone help me out here? But it's an interesting point.
We know that you may not find a gene mutation in a DNA sequence, but you may find mutations that are due to epigenetic effects. And so we also know that a lot of epigenetic effects can be influenced by environment. And so that could be the link between, eating, having, say, dairy cattle and turning on or off a gene, for example. So I thought that you might like to consider the role of epigenetics in this interaction between culture and gene activity.
Yeah. It's a very good point. Epigenetics is basically the process by which the expression of genes gets altered by usually methylation of the genome, not the changing of a sequence, as it were. And that can be something that can be passed on from a mother to a child, for example, without changing the sequence of the gene. So, for example, children born to starving women during the Dutch hunger winter of 1944 have a different diabetes propensity, and that's thought to be not because their genes are different, but because they inherited an epigenetic marker on the genome, as it were. I think this is a fascinating new area, and there's wonderful stuff to come from this. But I'm not convinced that it's anything other than Darwinism at one remove, as it were. It's still about selection among the epigenetic markers, as it were. So it complicates the picture hugely, but I don't yet see a lot of evidence that it necessarily changes it. But you're right. It means that sometimes we'll say, well, hang on, the genome didn't change. But something else did. The marking on the genome may have changed.
Particularly interesting to see how important the role of interpretation is when we're understanding facts within scientific arguments. My question is in relation to this idea of exchange, and I find it quite interesting. So we've got this evidence of exchange happening, and you point out that it's evidence of exchange with strangers. So it's not just reciprocity, that we've got different things being exchanged at different times. And then it seems to me that there's a leap to explaining it as trade. Is there any evidence that this is not simply gift-giving, what the Māori people call koha, and that might be exchanging different gifts? And if it was gift-giving rather than change, would that make a difference to your thesis?
Yeah, you're right. The difference between trade and gift-giving kind of blurs, as you go into certain simpler societies. I'll give you one example. It's too grand to call it a study, but there's a sort of series of anecdotes about early missionary contact with a tribe called the Yuront, somewhere near the Gulf of Carpentaria or the Cape York Peninsula in Queensland, where in the 19th century, where these guys lived on the coast and harvested stingray barbs and used them in exchange, essentially for stone axes, was one of the things that they were getting from these Kalkadoon tribe that I talked about. And this missionary actually described the exchange rate as it changed as the stingray barbs moved inland. In other words, the price of stone axes in stingray barbs changed as you got closer to the coast or closer to the Stone Age quarry. Now, did they think of it in terms of gift giving? I don't know, but it certainly, it quacks like a duck, it smells like a duck, there's trade involved. And I think, to some extent, there was this tendency in anthropology in the 50s and 60s to go off and say, look, this is all about gift giving. And I'm not convinced, and it's quite different from modern sort of mercantilist trade. And I'm not convinced. Yeah, the motivation is often obscure. And by the way, when you get trade started, it's probably dyadic. It's probably one-to-one. The evidence for this is twofold. One, that if you look at small-scale societies, this was often true that they would go to a trading point, a place, where you met in one season with another tribe, and you'd have a buddy in the other tribe, and you would sit down with him, and this is mainly from Native Americans, but you would sit down and say, and you'd build up this relationship over years with one person. And if you put undergraduates in a room in California and in front of computers and tell them to earn real money from a game involving villages that have different material, and they have to discover that trading works between the villages, you don't tell them that, then again you find these dyadic relationships build up rather than group-to-group relationships. So I think, and that might well feel more like a sort of, no, he's not my customer, he's my friend. But so there's a blurring there of interpretation.
I guess when you think about recombination, it's terribly wasteful. I mean, the more we mix and match, the more waste we get. And obviously, with recombination, a few combinations succeed, but of course, most of them fall by the wayside and don't work. Now, I was trying to think of your exchange situation and culture, and of course, we face currently a situation where there's too much waste, where in a sense, the amount we exchange is producing mountains of waste. And there's some analogy there, perhaps, to think about the recombination situation and the challenge of waste, if you like, that we currently face. Have you thought about that sort of concept?
Yes, I think the waste that's relevant, the waste that's analogous to the kind of thing you're talking about in recombination is the failure of entrepreneurs. You know, I mean, 90% of the people who tried to invent social networking went bust, and what's he called? Zuckerberg didn't. So if you look at the history of almost any technology or any idea or any culture, there are lots of people who have good ideas who don't make it, and very few who do. And we say, well, that's because he was clever and the others weren't, but it's not always the case, is it? So there's innovative entrepreneurial market economies are incredibly wasteful of talent in that sense. Most people fail. As somebody put it the other day, writing about this, they said, thank God for rational fools, because the only reason anyone becomes an entrepreneur is because they're a fool. No, an irrational fool, sorry. They think they can beat this incredible odds and start a company that'll survive instead of one that'll not survive. Thank God that people still think that when they should go off and become lawyers because it's easier. Or whatever. Sorry. Hope I haven't offended. I didn't say At the back, there's somebody who got it, I think. Oh, no, it's moving across.
Hi, I was wondering how a theory of memetics maps onto your account.
Yeah, good question. How does the theory of memetics map onto my ideas? And the meme theory that ideas behave like genes in that they replicate. Essentially, remember I ran through a series of slides of things that you need to find for an evolutionary system to work. Memetics is concentrating on that replication slide where I showed a picture of aeroplanes on an assembly line. Memetics is talking about whether ideas replicate and copy themselves, etc. And it's therefore part of the story, but I'm sort of focusing on the other parts of the story, at least particularly on the recombination part. So it's another analogy for a genetic evolutionary process, which is all part of the story. So it's a different emphasis, it's a different side of the same coin.
Thank you. I liked your the blue eyes and the lactose. How much further would you be prepared to go in explaining the incredible inventiveness in that European area? After all, in the last, 2,000 whatever years, look, I'm not very good at maths, there's been such an explosion in practically every area of knowledge that we enjoy today. So is that food? What is it?
I personally think you could tell the same story about China today, or China 1,000 years ago, or India 2,000 years ago, or Hong Kong at the moment. Or in other words, there are lots of parts of the world that, if the conditions are right, do tremendous amount of innovation. Now, what do they have in common, the places that are most inventive? And you're right, Northern Europe was fantastically successful and inventive at a certain period. It's ancient. The spotlight moves around the world and picks up these different places. It's India, then it's China, then it's Rome, then it's ancient Greece, then it's Renaissance Italy. Actually, the key, the simple ingredient is free trading cities, city-states, like ancient Greece, like Renaissance Italy, like the Hanseatic League in around the Baltic State, etc., like Hong Kong today. That seems to me to be the thing. So it's nothing to do with blue-eyed genes, as far as I can make out. I think people like the Chinese, who've been crushed under the jackboot of the Cultural Revolution for 20 years, come out the other side incredibly inventive. So it's we're all capable of it. Sorry, that was a rather potted version of 2,000 years of history. I apologize. I bet there are some historians in the audience.
Yeah, that's a very interesting talk. My question is, when we're developing, what we say, we're developing in what sense? Are we developing to a more peaceful society? Because nowadays, we're much more materialistic. We're developing materially, that's for sure. But, you have a look and see, like we're still killing each other as well. I mean, have a look at America, People generally regard America as a first world country. And so, people there are much more intelligent. But hey, America is also one of those countries which elected people like President Bush. And they didn't, didn't elect him for one term, but 2 terms. And he didn't even start one war, but he started 2 wars. So, my question is, how do we develop, how are we developing, are we developing towards a more peaceful society?
Yeah, we are, is the answer. The 2000s, the decade just ended, was the decade with the fewest number of deaths in wars globally since the Second World War. It doesn't feel like that to us in Britain, because we were involved in 2 rather horrible wars in that decade. We had a lot of deaths in wars. True for Australia too, I'm sure. But globally, that was true. And the decade before that was the most peaceful at the time, etc. We are actually on a declining path of violence. It's incredible. And look at the homicide rates. The homicide rate in Western Europe, yeah, it sort of bounces around a bit, but it's about 1/100th of what it was in the Middle Ages. You can go back and homicide is one of the few violent crimes for which you can get decent statistics. Well, no, because it was recorded, as it were, in a way that other violent crimes weren't. But if you look at the death rate from violence in hunter-gatherer societies, from Papua New Guinea, for example, and you project that into the 20th century, and you say how many people would have died in the 20th century if that death rate had prevailed, compared with how many did die in the 20th century, it's about 10 times as much. So although the 20th century was horribly bloody and probably 100 million people died, it should have been 1 billion people. Yeah, we're not perfect. We've got a long way to go. And things are going wrong in certain countries, and they're going in the wrong direction, etc. But we are not getting less peaceful. We're getting more peaceful.
Sorry, just a little bit more. Now, as we are developing more, we are also encountering more problems as well, because we're having these problems of developed society syndromes, hey, we're getting more issues in depression, and all that comes along.
Yep, absolutely. Obesity, depression. There are some things that are getting worse, but there's an awful lot of things that are getting better.
My explanations I've always heard for the difference in inventive rates is that if you live in Australia, you can go and play on the beach for the afternoon. If you live in England, the climate's so bloody awful that there's nothing to do but go down into your cave and invent something.
It's pretty odd. I've been in Australia for 4 days and it's rained every day. I just came from a drought in England.
Weather in Melbourne, wait a day, it'll change.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's. I'm just trying to think. I'm thinking of something else. I agree. It sort of makes sense, but then there were some pretty hot places that were pretty inventive at different times too. So I mean, Italy. Renaissance Italy was this ferment of innovation. Where is, Italy's the one place you would feel like just sitting back and relaxing, isn't it?
Hi. I really enjoyed your talk over here. I liked the bit at the start when you spoke about how the evolution of lactose digestion at a genetic level was driven by cultural events. And I was wondering if you still felt like that was the case in today's society, where there are a lot of levelers such as government assistance and things like that to level the playing field when there is genetic diversity still present.
Yeah, it's certainly true that if you keep people alive who would otherwise die, you blunt natural selection. But that's such a long, that used to bother people terrifically in the eugenic era, in the early 20th century. But frankly, I think it's a price worth paying to be kind, so it doesn't bother me at all, as it were. And besides, remember, it's not just, you don't just have to survive, you also have to reproduce if you want to succeed in the next generation. Differential reproduction is still happening in all sorts of ways. So, for example, there is strong selection pressure today, Richard Dawkins has argued, for the incompetence in the use of contraceptives. Sorry.
Well, on that note, I think it is about time to draw this to a close. Look, Matt, thank you so much indeed. It's been a wonderful, wonderful address to open this festival. I don't think we could have had a finer way of starting it. So, Matt, thank you very, very much indeed. You can tell from the quality and the diversity of the questions how much we've enjoyed it. So thank you very much indeed. We're very grateful.
you